Thank you for having me. I've now worked with tourism and climate change for more than a quarter of a century, and that's kind of the point when you reflect on your life, and I did that last week. And unfortunately, my first realization was that in the next life, I'm not going to be a climate scientist, because it's very, very frustrating. The second insight is that it's very difficult to reach through to audiences about climate change. For you to really understand, I would have to have a time machine. I would send you 20 years into the future for just 1 minute. And coming back here, you would be shell-shocked, because you would have understood that we have already entered the beginning of the age of non-tourism. 80 years ago, mass tourism started in Europe. 80 years from now, I'm doubtful there will be much tourism left in the world. This is a risk map that we developed for global tourism based on 27 indicators. Essentially, you can translate the color scheme as yellow and red. That's where you're no longer going to travel. And if you think Europe looks good, then that is a very relative assumption. We have recently started research to look into weather extremes in Europe. We've looked at thunderstorms, extreme precipitation events, and fire weather, where these have occurred. And you can see that in some European regions, we have a very real risk related to weather extremes that is already affecting tourism, sometimes in very problematic ways. If you think about, for instance, roads a couple of years back and the dramatic, traumatic experiences some travelers have had in that situation. In many of these regions, this trend is going to become worse. This is the trend in extremes for Europe. And again, you can see that for some regions that are already affected by climate change, this will be something that gets much worse in the near future. So, better be prepared. How are we better prepared? I think, first of all, by understanding the system. We have a lot of media reporting that is most of the time not very close to the scientific state of the art. Hence, a little understanding here of the traveler and how the decision-making process works and how climate change will weigh into decision-making. You have the traveler over here, you have internal factors for holiday making and external factors, for instance, cost. I'll come back to cost in a minute. Then you have the different destination appeal and travel motivation factors, and travel decisions at the moment are made on the basis of these, but now climate change is coming into this, mostly in the experience of weather extremes, but also, for example, in media reports where tourists and prospective tourists are told certain truths about climates in certain destinations. So what we see is essentially that 4 different aspects will affect travel and tourism in the future and are already affecting travel and tourism. Climate and weather, that's mostly in the form of raised temperatures, extreme events, but we also have asset losses. This year, in some regions of Europe, we had a good winter with good snow for skiing. But what we see is that we lose assets in many low-lying destinations when it comes to snow, but we also have a reduction in beaches due to sea level rise and other events, freshwater biodiversity. All of that is going to be a factor in future tourism. Then we have the cost of climate, and I'll talk about that in a minute, because that, to me, is the biggest risk that we are facing in tourism. And in the longer term, we have socioeconomic stability, essentially what I showed in my first map, the countries where you will no longer travel because of destabilization processes that make these countries insecure and no longer suitable for travel. As a tourist, we obviously have expectations. When we travel, we make our decisions on the basis of what we think we know or what we have experienced in the past. We do then visit a destination, have certain experiences that again shape our understanding of the destination, and then after the trip, we will re-evaluate. And the good news is tourists are rather stable in their destination loyalty. It takes a lot for tourists to decide to no longer travel to a certain destination. It has to be something that is rather traumatic before people forget about that, or before they make the decision to no longer travel to that destination. That is a good thing. The problem that we will have in the near future is, in my opinion, a different one. And that's why cost becomes such an important factor. I think what we're seeing at the moment is already that we have, on the destination business side, revenue shortfall as a result of climate change, for instance, because of weather extremes. We also see that there are seasonal reductions in shifts in tourism because destinations are no longer snow reliable, for example. We then have a growing cost of adaptation. We have property insurance, preliminary figures that I've seen for the US, for instance, relevant now after the fires in California. Property insurance has gone up by 10% in just 1 year. So you can see that is a problem specifically if insurable is no longer available, because some insurances will no longer insure property in certain locations. Then you also have the risk of uninsurable damage here. We have the cost of the low carbon transition. For European aviation alone, that cost has been recently put at 2.4 trillion to mid-century. That's 100 billion per year. You will tell me who is going to pay that, but I will tell you it's not going to be airlines because their profitability is zero. We have an operational increase, for example, when there's a higher cost of energy for, say, air conditioning. We see that food prices for some staples are going up quickly. Coffee prices have doubled, I think, in the last 10 years. All of that is becoming relevant. Then we also have productivity losses. People under heat stress will not work as efficiently as workers in normal conditions. That cost has to be passed on, at least partially, if businesses want to remain viable economically. And then tourists will also face new costs, such as travel insurance, and then you have a total cost increase that could become quite relevant already in the near future. I think it's already there, even though most people say at the moment we will rather save on money elsewhere than on travel. But we will reach the point where that is no longer an option. So the cost is, in my opinion, the major factor that we are going to face in the near-term future when we talk about climate change. It's not going to be weather extremes, because these are not, as yet, very frequent and distributed evenly. They will become relevant in specific locations for specific lengths of time. In the longer term, we also have the loss of assets. We talked about snow, beach. There's now a number of studies on beach reductions because of sea level rise. And that will also threat quite a lot of tourism destinations, because obviously beaches are quite central. In other areas, we have huge losses in biodiversity. Diving tourism, also something that has become increasingly important for destinations, might be affected by that. You want to see a colorful reef, not rubble, and that will be something that also becomes more relevant. And then in the longer term, we have the socioeconomic stability issue that I talked about. The big difficulty is now to sort of present this in a way that makes sense to you. So I've tried to squeeze this all into one slide, but we need to talk about different time frames. We always talk about climate change as if that was something that will occur soon or at some unspecified point in the future. So I think it's important that we move towards decades as a marker as to when events will occur. And as you can see, I have tried to summarize this for the 2030s. You can look at this later in more detail if you want. This is under publication with Daniel Scott. We are trying to figure out what is going to happen when these aspects will become relevant. Can't go into detail, but just to give you an understanding as to when instability will occur and which aspects of the tourism system will be affected. Now to tourism's contribution to climate change, and I'll just go through a number of infographics that have been developed by my colleague Eoghan Sun at the University of Queensland in Australia, and were published recently in Nature Communications. Tourism is now 8.8% of all emissions in the world. You have to bear in mind that only 2 to 4% of the world's population fly internationally in a given year. So we're talking about a small share of the global population that is responsible for these emissions, and that's about 5 times the size of France. And there's also been a major increase over the last 10 years by 1.5 gigatons. Tourism is growing faster than other economic sectors. You see that tourism emissions grow by about 3.5% per year. That means at this rate, they will double in 2 decades. And that is already including efficiency gains, right? And we see that global emissions have been increasing by 1.5% between 2009 and 2019. So the global economy is growing much slower in terms of emissions. Who is responsible? In terms of countries, it's interesting to see that the US, always topping emissions from tourism since the beginning of measurements, but China and India are now the second and third largest emitters of emissions from tourism, which is quite interesting because most of us will probably still associate these regions with a lower travel intensity. And in total, we have 20 countries that together account for 75% of emissions. Germany, by the way, is on the fourth spot of emissions by country. Then, what is our main problem? It's aviation. It's the sector that is contributing the most to emissions. This is not even including non-CO2 effects. You might have heard that in the upper troposphere, lower stratosphere, aviation is contributing to additional warming through nitrous oxides and water emissions. This is not included. Still, aviation is 52% of the overall carbon footprint, and that is something of a headache, as I'll discuss in a minute. Last, every tourism dollar is very carbon intense. Most people still tend to see tourism as a white industry with low emissions per unit of value generated. But that is not true. You can see that per US dollar, emissions in tourism are slightly above 1 kilo of CO2 equivalent, whilst in the global economy it's 0.77. So further tourism growth for most countries means that emissions will rise. There have been some studies suggesting the opposite, but at the global scale, this is not true. At this point, I had to decide what to talk about. And most of the time, we want to talk about the measures that we should all take, like how could we reduce emissions in tourism? And I decided it's not really something that advances the issues. So I decided to instead talk about the systemic or structural barriers that we have in the system as to why we are not making progress on emission reductions. And what I came up with is something that is probably a bit different from what you expect here. But there's 4 major issues that I think are barriers, transition barriers in the mitigation gamble. Petromasculinity, techno-optimism, boosterism, and network capital. And what do these mean? Let me elaborate. Petromasculinity is not male versus female. It's rather the way of gendered thinking that forecloses radical action. And if you look at the key aspects of petromasculinity here, it's that fossil fuels act as power and identity. Looking over the Atlantic, I think I can say that without becoming political, will tell you what I mean. We have reactionary politics and also gendered backlash associated with emissions. We even did a paper on this in the context of aeromasculinities. But if we counted this audience, I'm sure there is a greater share of female views in this audience being interested in climate change than male. And if you look at the CEOs of our global institutions, I think it's clear that climate change is not high on the agenda, and I would propose that is also linked to patriarchal. So we have to rethink even from a gender perspective when we talk the future. The second is techno-optimism. Technology optimism, techno-optimism. I've done a lot of research on this. This is from a recent publication that you will have to read in detail in order to get a better understanding. But essentially what you're seeing here is the development of global aviation depicted in different key performance indicators. And one thing that people often talk about, sorry, I wanted this one, is the development of emissions per revenue passenger kilometer, because that shows that over time, aviation has become vastly more efficient. That is what people love to talk about. They do not talk about the global growth of emissions, and this was 2022, we are now back here, which is our real indicator of progress on climate change, because the climate system is not interested in relative efficiency gains. What we need to look at is total emissions, and you can see that we are totally not on track when it comes to that. The problem is that we need to decarbonize aviation if we want to have a carbon neutral tourism system. But the current cost of using 100% sustainable aviation fuels is 200 times greater than the profitability of the aviation sector. I was surprised to learn when we did this research that the average amount of money earned, the profit made by global airlines over the last 45 years per passenger has been less than $1. With that profitability, you cannot restructure a system that for Europe alone is projected to cost 2.4 trillion over the next 25 years. You will understand that technology optimism is not going to get us into the realms of progress that we need. Then we have boosterism. That's the next underlying problem. You might even be shareholders of large tourism corporations. But obviously, what is the sole purpose of a large tourism corporation? It's to grow. And when you look at the growth rates that you have projected for literally any large tourism corporation in the world, you will see that in order to decarbonize, you would have to have annual decarbonization rates of at least 12% per year. During the pandemic, in the first year, 2020, the global economy decarbonized by 6%, mostly because we didn't have air transport. How are you going to achieve 12% if global corps continue to grow? And we calculated that the largest 29 corporations that we have in the world are alone already accounting for, I think it was 34% of global emissions. So it's not going to happen if we do not start to question growth. And last, boosterism, or this is part of the picture here, actually, of boosterism. This is another study we did on NTOs, National Tourism Organizations, and where they do marketing. I see that, unfortunately, the outlines of the world map have disappeared here. But what you can see is that, essentially, Canada is doing marketing in these countries. I think the most marketing-intense country in the world is Spain. 33 different countries. Sweden was one with only 6. we try to blow up our tourism systems. And very often, it's long-haul markets because these are perceived to be important. Indonesia, Brazil coming up, that's where NTO managers seem to think that most of the money can be made by bringing tourists into a national economy. Unfortunately, this also means that emissions are going to rise. So we have to rethink on this basis. Then last year, network capital. And it's another thing that is quite important. I've chosen here travel influencers. We have recently checked that the 100 most important travel influencers in the world reach out to about 100 million people. You all know how celebrities like to tweet and Instagram about their daily travel, but you are travel influencers as well. And what we create are these aspirational lifestyles by showing others that there is social capital to be had in communicating travel. But that is a driver of growth as well, obviously. So we have different processes here that are barriers to progress, and I think we have to start digging at the most fundamental level to understand where we are. And unfortunately, I'm not seeing that our global supranational organizations, from the World Economic Forum, in my opinion, largely meaningless report on the future of travel, but you might think otherwise, to ICAO, UNWTO, they are not advancing these issues fast enough and with the ambition that we need. But obviously, this goes for all of us. We want the system to change, ignoring that we are the system. So I hope that all of you will make more of a contribution, even though I don't have a time machine to take you into the futures that would make you change your minds. Thank you.